13 people walked into a quiet buffet on the edge of town, drawn by a neon sign that promised a free reopening night. They laughed, filled their plates, clinked glasses, and thought nothing of the man moving silently in the kitchen. Thomas Hale had been dismissed, mocked, and forgotten, but he had not forgotten them. Every insult, every laugh at his expense, every door slammed on his career was written down in a notebook he called his special menu. He knew who would come. He knew what time the lock would click. And when the last guest stepped inside, the door sealed shut. The flames in the kitchen burned blue, the Wi-Fi died, and the walls began to breathe with gas. The buffet was no longer a restaurant. It was a trap, a cage built of humiliation, memory, and revenge. This is the story of Thomas Hale, the outcast chef with a list, and the night free food turned into a deadly feast. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sign flickered against the night. Red and green tubes buzzed above a narrow street, spelling out "Free Buffet, Grand Reopening." A moth circled the light. The glow spilled onto wet asphalt, cutting a crooked square of color into the dark. At 6 p.m. the first guest arrived. Shoes squeaked on the damp pavement. A hand pushed the glass door. The sensor gave a mechanical chime. The lock clicked behind them, sharp as a metronome. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of fried oil and boiled rice. A faint tang of gas lingered beneath. The floor was carpeted in brown loops. Moisture rose through the fibers, sticky against the soles. A row of tables waited, set with plastic napkin holders and thin forks. Metal trays sat beneath clouded glass, lids beaded with condensation. Steam hissed through vents, fading into the hum of the overhead fans. Above the serving line hung a clock. Its frame was plastic, once white, now yellowed. The second hand leapt unevenly. Each tick came late, then doubled. The sound cut across the hush like a drop of water in an empty room. Guests glanced up, frowned, and then ignored it. The menu stood on a stand near the door. It was handwritten in black marker. The paper curled at the corners, greasy fingerprints along the edge. One corner was stained by red ink, blurred as if it had been scrubbed too hard. Beneath the stain, the letters warped, unreadable, a smear rather than a word. By 6:10 p.m., 3 more people entered. Jackets shook off rainwater. The glass door sighed shut each time. The same click repeated, consistent, metallic. Each guest moved to the trays, lifted lids, spooned food. Steam rose around their faces. The smell of soy and onion clung to their sleeves. The lighting overhead wavered. Fluorescent bars buzzed in their frames, one stuttering in half-seconds of dim and glare. The shift made shadows stretch and shrink across the floor. A woman poured soup and saw her hand ripple in the reflection. She laughed, embarrassed, then stepped away. The hum of the refrigerator lined the back wall. It was deep, low, vibrating through the floorboards. In the lull between voices, it became the only sound, joined by the tick of the clock. Tick, hum, a rhythm like breath. At 6:20 p.m., the 5th guest entered. The door beeped, closed, and locked again. They glanced back, but the handle gave no resistance. They thought nothing of it. The buffet line gleamed, trays fogged with heat, plates stacked high. The rhythm of clinking utensils filled the room, steady as rain. On the far wall, a neon exit sign glowed above a steel door. Its letters pulsed faintly. Dust hung around the frame. No one tested it. Chairs scraped. Drinks were poured. Phones lit up screens with blue light. Laughter carried under the fluorescent buzz. The clock ticked louder than it should. The second hand dragged forward, then snapped back, then lurched again. Guests kept eating. A spoon fell, rang sharp against tile, then silence returned. A child pointed at the sign outside through the window, the letters flickering. The B in buffet sputtered, died, then sparked again. At 6:30 p.m. the air shifted. The fan slowed, blades whining. The hum of the refrigerator deepened into a groan. Steam hissed stronger from the trays, curling against the glass. The floor vibrated once, then settled. No one spoke. Forks scraped plates. The clock ticked on. The glass door at the front shuddered as if pulled by air. The frame trembled, a final guest entered, the door closed, the lock clicked harder than before, echoing down the narrow room. No one moved, the clock ticked, offbeat, relentless. The lock clicked, the clock kept counting. Thomas Hale had worked kitchens for 20 years. None kept him long, they called him slow, clumsy, weak with a knife. He moved with a stoop, shoulders narrow, eyes cast down. His voice was rarely heard. His silence made him forgettable. His mistakes made him memorable. One night a manager hurled his hat into the trash. The white cotton dome hit grease, slumped and stained. The kitchen laughed. The fryer hissed beside him, drowning out his protest. He bent, picked it up and placed it on his head again. A black footprint marked the crown. Another shift ended with a dull knife shoved into his hand. Useless, a line cook said, tossing it across the counter. The blade had no edge. It bent against onion skin. He placed it back on the rack, wiping fingerprints from the handle. A month later, a letter arrived. The paper was thin, stamped in red across the margin, terminated. No reason, only a date. The word bled through the envelope like a wound. He folded it twice, slid it into a drawer, and never threw it away. At 9 p.m. in his rented room, the lamp on his desk glowed weak yellow. Its cord hummed faintly against the wall. Wallpaper curled in the corners, damp from leaking pipes. The only furniture, a chair, a table, a narrow bed. On the table lay one object placed square to the edge, a notebook bound in cracked leather. The cover was unmarked, the spine bent from use. Inside, each page bore names, dates. A single symbol beside them, a tiny knife inked in sharp black lines. Some names were scratched over until paper tore. A few pages were missing, ripped away clean at the seam. The absence left a ghostly edge of fiber as if erased from history. He turned pages slowly, fingertips brushing ink grooves. Each name matched a memory, a voice, a face. The paper carried them more faithfully than his own mind. The notebook was not for recipes, it was a menu. The ritual followed a pattern. At 9:30 p.m. he lit a short candle. The flame bent in the draft. He placed the dull knife beside the book. From under his bed he slid a whetstone worn concave by years of use. Water dripped onto its surface, spreading across old scratches. He drew the knife in slow strokes. Metal rasped against stone, a dry, high-pitched scrape, over and over until sparks of friction hissed faintly in the dark. At 10 p.m. he paused, tested the blade against his fingertip. Not cutting, only grazing. The edge whispered as it passed. He nodded once. Then he closed the notebook with care, tied the strap around its cover, and extinguished the candle. Smoke curled upward, bitter, coating the air with the smell of burnt wick. Some nights he opened a drawer instead. Inside lay the hat with its black footprint, the fabric stiffened from grease. Next to it the letter with its red stamp. The two objects sat side by side, evidence of dismissal. He kept them pressed flat under folded paper like flowers in a book. He never threw them away. Neighbors rarely saw him. When they did, he carried groceries in plain bags, always the same contents: onions, rice, matches, sharpening oil. His footsteps on the stairs were slow, even, always at the same hour. The sound carried through the thin walls like a metronome. In the restaurant world he was called many things. Slow Knife was the one that stuck. The insult traveled from kitchen to kitchen, a nickname passed like salt across the counter. He never denied it, he never answered. He wrote it in the margin of his notebook once, then scratched it out with heavy lines until the page tore. At 11 p.m. he prepared the ritual again. Water on the stone, knife on the water, a scrape that matched the tick of the clock. Outside, cars passed on the wet street. Inside, the rhythm repeated, metallic and patient. The notebook opened again. Tonight he added a name. He wrote in block letters, careful not to smear the ink. A date followed. Then the small knife symbol, angled downward like a blade resting on a board. He closed the book, tied the strap, and placed it square on the desk. The room sank into silence. Only the hum of the lamp remained. On the floor beneath the chair, shavings of metal dust caught the weak light, glittering like filings of memory. He slid the dull knife back into its drawer. He left the sharp one on the table. Its edge reflected the yellow glow of the lamp. The book sat beside it, square, patient, complete for now. The hat with the footprint stayed folded away. The letter with the red stamp stayed pressed between pages. The objects waited, lined in their places, carrying the weight of past insults. When the clock reached midnight, he turned off the lamp. The room vanished into dark. Only the faint smell of oil, candle smoke, and sharpened steel lingered. The book lay unseen but not forgotten. His knife stayed sharp, his list sharper. By 6:40 p.m. the tables filled. Steam fogged the glass covers of the buffet line. Stainless steel trays reflected distorted faces, eyes stretched wide, mouths blurred into pale ovals, each reflection bent under the fluorescent hum. The former manager arrived first. He carried himself upright, tie still loose from the office, voice loud. Years before he had shouted across a crowded dining hall, calling Thomas Hale incompetent in front of staff and guests. Now he filled a plate high with fried chicken, grease dripping onto his cuff. He glanced into the tray, adjusted his hair in the warped reflection, then turned away. Beside him stood a customer from long ago. She wore thick glasses and a red coat. She once spat food onto a plate and demanded her money back, waving her receipt in the air. Tonight she scooped rice into her bowl, steam fogging her lenses. She wiped them with a napkin, leaving streaks that caught the light. At another corner, a former coworker lined up. He leaned against the counter, scrolling his phone, thumbs flashing. He had once slid a dull knife across the prep table to Thomas and laughed, calling him "slow knife." The phrase traveled down the kitchen that night like an order. Now he tapped at the buffet lid, impatient at the pace of the server. Two students pushed through the door, shoes wet from the street. One of them had held a phone over the stove years before, recording Thomas's trembling hands as a pan flared and burned. The clip was shared, passed, and mocked. They still carried that phone, its screen bright against their faces. They filled their trays, laughing in whispers that echoed against the steel lids. By 6:50 p.m. more arrived. A housewife in a faded cardigan carried a canvas shopping bag. She pressed it against her side as she filled a plate with vegetables. She moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, head bowed to the trays. The reflection showed her mouth set thin, jaw rigid. A taxi driver followed. His jacket reeked of exhaust. Coins jingled in his pocket as he ladled soup into a chipped bowl. He sat near the door, watching the neon outside sputter, chewing in silence. Steam from the bowl rose around his face, blurring his features into mist. At the next table, a family of 3 settled in. The father wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The mother arranged napkins into neat squares. Their child scraped a fork against the plate in rhythmic bursts, the sound sharp and grating. Each scrape mirrored the clock's offbeat tick on the wall. They ate without speaking, eyes fixed on their plates. 2 more guests arrived together, a young couple. Their hands stayed linked even as they carried trays. They shared glances in the mirrored surface of the food warmers, laughing softly. The sound cut against the steady hum of the fans. Their reflection on the steel stretched thin, faces doubled and blurred into one. By 7 p.m. the room was full, chairs scraped, utensils clattered. The smell of grilled meat mingled with the faint sting of gas near the burners. The noise masked a sharper sound from behind the staff-only door. A blade rasped against stone, metal against grit. One guest, the taxi driver, looked up. The door was ajar, a narrow crack. He squinted toward the slit of darkness, heard the scrape again, then turned back to his soup. On the buffet line, the trays gleamed. Their surfaces showed each face in fragments, a forehead, an eye, a distorted grin. Guests checked their appearance in the warped reflections, smoothing hair, fixing collars. None looked long. The glass fogged with steam, obscuring detail, dissolving outlines into blur. The fluorescent bulb above the rice tray flickered. Each flash lit the trays in bursts of white, then shadow. The reflections jerked like film frames. A spoon fell, clanged against steel, then stilled. Conversations hushed for a moment, then resumed. At 7:10 p.m. the clock struck with a stutter. The second hand jumped, froze, then jerked forward. No one noticed. plates piled high, drinks fizzed in plastic cups, phones buzzed with notifications, laughter scattered across the tables. The room felt ordinary, almost safe, yet the serving trays kept shining, bending every face into a mask. The reflections were not smiles but smears of light, stretched and cold. Each mirrored face was strange, unrecognizable, like a list of names without context, lined in order, waiting to be read. They came hungry. He came prepared. At 7 p.m. the front door clacked and held. The glass quivered in its frame. The handle moved a fraction and stopped. The sensor chimed once, bright and pointless, then went silent. Neon from outside washed the pane in red and green bands that bled across the floor. The exit door took a hit and answered with a dull thud. The bar bounced back, hard and clean. The sign above it glowed a steady red. Heat gathered around the casing and turned the paint faintly tacky. A chair leg scraped. A fork rang against tile and lay still. From the pass, a seam of blue light ran along polished steel. The burners drew a straight line of flame that bent toward green at the edges. The color climbed the tiles and painted the underside of the hood. Heat pressed into the threshold, spreading like a low tide. Phones appeared. Faces lit in pale squares. Signal bars sat empty. A thumb opened settings, found the house network and tried the password. Green answered in flat text, access denied. The phrase returned the same way each retry. The screen dimmed. The light went out. The clock over the buffet ticked wrong. The second hand jumped, paused, and lurched again. The sound cut the room into slices. Reflections on the stainless trays jittered with each tick. Cheeks stretched. Eyes thinned. Mouths turned to bright smears. Steam drew lines and erased them, then drew them again. A bulb above the salad pan swelled white, then burst. It sounded like a knuckle cracking. Powdered glass fell in a soft sheet over lettuce and cucumber. Larger pieces skittered and chimed on steel. A woman covered the pan with a tray lid and slid it aside. The lid rang once and settled crooked, reflecting a crooked face. The fans changed pitch. Their hum sagged, rough at the edges. The new tone climbed the walls, ran along the ceiling grid, and came back as a faint vibration in the table legs. The air hit the back of the throat. Fried oil, onion, a thin edge of gas that made the sweetness of soda taste wrong. At 7:03 p.m. the former manager planted his shoulder into the entrance handle. "Open," he said as if he were giving an order. The door shuddered and stayed. He hit it again. The hinge clicked once, crisp as a pen cap. The glass showed him back at himself, wider and shorter than he was, a reflection stamped by metal. A scrape came from behind the staff-only door. Steel on stone, dry and controlled. The rhythm found the clock and made a crooked duet. It stopped. It returned. It stopped completely. The silence that followed made the scrape feel longer. The buffet line kept shining. The trays picked up faces and handed them back altered. Foreheads looked taller. Chins looked thin. A student smoothed his hair in a tray and laughed without sound. The sound did not leave his throat because the fans ate it. At 7:06 p.m. the Wi-Fi listing flashed and vanished. Phones went back into pockets. A napkin entered a white knuckle grip and crumpled into a stiff ball. Condensation on plastic cups ran to rims and dripped onto laminate. Drops made dark dots like punctuation along the edge of the table. The flames steadied into bars, blue, straight, and sure. They did not flicker with the draft. They climbed to the lip of each ring and held together as if joined. Heat bled across the pass in an invisible sheet. The kitchen reeked as a cage made of light. The taxi driver put his palm to the exit bar until it paled. He inhaled through his teeth and pulled back. He rubbed his hand on his jacket and looked through the door at the neon. "Call somebody," he said. "No bars," the student answered. The words were flat and heavy like coins dropping into a jar. At 7:10 p.m. a second bulb hummed, flickered, and hung on. The hum pitched against the fans. It made the room sound tight. Steam thickened under the sneeze guard, beating and running in clear tracks that pooled at the metal lip and fell in regular drips. The drips tapped the tray lids like a light rain. A child pushed the entrance handle and looked up. The sensor made a weak chirp and died. The lock gave a precise internal click, small and final. The child stepped back. The parent folded a napkin into a square and pressed it flat with both hands. The paper creased into a sharp white cross. At 7:13 p.m. the staff-only door stood open a hand's width. The seam showed light the color of a swimming pool at night. The rasp on stone returned once. It ended as if a fingertip had lifted. No one went closer. The line of blue at the pass brightened instead. The clock ticked late. The second hand lagged and then snapped forward. The sound cut across breathing and utensil clatter. A spoon slid off a plate and rang against the floor. The neon outside stuttered. The B in buffet died, came back dim, and stained the glass with a green ghost of its own letter. At 7:16 p.m. someone tried the side door that led to the alley. The knob turned a fraction and met steel. The wall took the thud and gave a hollow answer. The air settled heavier. A bead of sweat rolled from temple to jaw and hung on the curve of a collarbone before it dropped. The flames stayed precise. They laid blue rails under the hood and made the air above them tremble. Grease tracks on the tile caught the light and drew bars along the floor. The bars ran to the line where the dining room carpet began and broke there like water. A voice at the door tried humor. "Free buffet, no exit." It landed without a human sound. Another voice said, "Don't touch the salad." The glass in that pan still winked like salt under the lid. A hand pushed it farther down the line. At 7:20 p.m. the refrigerator against the wall slipped into a deeper note. The compressor shuddered and held. The new tone filled the gaps between breaths. The room acquired a slow pulse. The pulse made every fork scrape feel timed. The clock kept jumping. Steam kept drifting. Faces kept warping in the trays. The list existed without paper. The room arranged people in rows and reflected them back as a record. Names were unnecessary when the metal cataloged shape and motion. At 7:24 p.m. the TV above the dessert freezer woke. It was a box model strapped to a steel arm, edges furred with dust. The screen brightened from black to gray and held there. A high whine slid into hearing and flattened out. A rectangle of block text stamped the upper left, archive. A date appeared in pale numbers. The first clip showed a kitchen like this one. Younger tiles, a newer hood, a man in a tie pointed and spoke off camera. A younger Thomas Hale held a knife by the spine, presenting it. The audio bled laughter. "Slow knife," a voice said close to the mic, wet and pleased. The knife slid back at him across the counter, handle first. The image jumped. Another angle, the same room. The hat flew into the frame, hit grease, and took a black print in the crown. The camera pushed in on the mark until it filled the picture. In the dining room now, the former manager stood under the broken bulb and did not move. The TV jumped again. A phone clip, vertical and tremoring. A pan flared. Thomas stepped back. The off-screen chorus rose. "Look at him, slow knife, back up." The frame froze on his face. His gaze was not at the lens but past it, toward a clock high on the wall. The second hand in that frame lurched, then missed a beat, then caught up. The buttons on the TV were taped over with brown tape. The wordplay pulsed once in a corner and did not go away. No remote lay on any table. No staff stood near the set. The audio carried a second sound under the laughter. Steel drawn on stone, thin and dry, a present noise layered under past voices. Steam curled around the cabinet and fogged the lower edge of the screen. The flames at the pass held like bars under glass. The heat climbed the dining wall by degrees and met the cold face of the exit sign without changing it. At 7:28 p.m. a man grabbed the TV mount and yanked. The arm groaned. The screen swung and straightened. The image did not blink. Archive stayed. The date stayed. The footage kept naming people without names. The entrance lock clicked once. The noise was tiny and absolute. The fans lost another note. The gas drew its lines and kept them. The buffet was sealed. The shame replayed. At 7:31 p.m. the first blow landed on the front door. A shoulder struck glass. The pane flexed and held. The handle rattled against its seat and stopped. The sensor chirped once, thin and late. The neon outside threw red and green bands over the floor and turned faces pale. The second blow came harder. The hinge clicked and settled. A fork slid off a plate and chimed against tile. Chairs scraped in a harsh chorus. The exit bar thudded twice and bounced back, hard as a spring. The sign above it glowed without flicker, a red block in a rising heat. The air thickened. Fried oil smoked at the edges. Onion steam sharpened into a sting. A thin seam of gas threaded the room and curled behind the tongue. It turned soda flat and meat sweet. The fan sagged a note and never found it again. The refrigerator answered with a slow, indifferent bass that made the table legs hum. A child coughed. A napkin went over a mouth and stayed. Someone tied a scarf across their face. The cloth darkened where breath touched it. Sweat ran from temples to collars and beaded on the bridge of noses. The carpet grew tacky under shoes. At 7:33 p.m. a camera on the ceiling blinked. It was a white dome in a yellowed tile. A red LED pulsed behind the plastic. The light reflected in the sneeze guard and doubled. A guest pointed up. "There," he said. Another guest saw a second dot near the pass, then a third by the door. The dots took turns with the clock blink versus tick, like two hands counting different time. A speaker near the ceiling clicked alive. It did not carry voices. It carried rhythm. Knife on board, even and dry. Chop, chop, chop. The sound looped tight, a studio-clean track without room noise. It matched the offbeat clock for a measure and then ran ahead. The room aligned with it in small ways. Forks tapped, heels shifted, breathing changed. The former manager hit the entrance handle again. The pane shook. A hairline in the corner whitened and held. "Open," he said, louder. The word thudded against glass and fell to the floor. A student struck the exit bar with both hands and hissed through teeth. The bar returned the energy without sympathy. At 7:36 p.m. a phone lit by itself. The student held it chest high. The camera faced out toward the tables. The screen showed the room from the phone's lens with a sharp white border and a red dot in the corner. A title bar sat across the top in block text, "Menu Spatial Tonight." The viewer count read 0. Chat was disabled. The timer began at 00:01 and climbed. He turned in a slow circle. The image turned with him. The ceiling domes glowed red in the frame. The knife rhythm came through the phone speaker a fraction late and made an echo. He tried to close the app. The button did nothing. He pressed the side key. The screen dimmed and brightened but never left the stream. At 7:38 p.m. someone dragged a chair under a camera and climbed. The chair legs rocked on the looped carpet. Fingers reached for the dome and missed. The second jump caught the rim. The dome did not move. A metal screw mount held it firm. The climber slipped, hit the table, and knocked a plate to the floor. The plate shattered in straight, clean shards that flashed under fluorescent light. The speaker cut and resumed. The knife track continued, metronomic, a ledger in sound. Chop, chop, chop. The rhythm wrote in air where paper could not. The clock ticked wrong over it. Tick, pause, tick, tick. The two lines never agreed. At 7:40 p.m. a group gathered at the front door with a metal tray for a shield. They counted off, then ran. The tray hit the glass and rang like a gong. The pane bowed. A spiderweb crept from the corner crack. A shard jumped and nicked a hand. Blood welled fast and bright and pattered onto the tray. A white towel wrapped the palm. Red bled through in a slow bloom and then a faster one. The towel held the shape of a hand in perfect outline. The smell of hot metal met the smell of gas and made the air taste of coins. The flames at the pass stayed blue and straight, bars laid flat. Heat trembled above them and turned the hood into a mirror of water. Grease on tile took the light and drew rails across the kitchen floor. The rails ran to the carpet and broke, then reappeared in reflection along the stainless procession of trays. At 7:42 p.m. the old television finished one clip and loaded another. Archive held in the corner. The screen showed an office door. A letter with red stamps sat on a desk. A hand folded it twice and opened it again. Laughter bled over the image from off-screen. Slow knife, said a voice, close and pleased, the speaker flaring with spit sound. The present room answered with nothing but breath and the percussion of the chopping track. The taxi driver lifted the towel to check the cut and set it back. The red mark deepened. He stared at his palm as if reading ink. He pressed the towel harder and tied it with a knot that sat on the wrist like a cuff. He stood and pushed the exit bar again, weaker. The bar returned his weight and hummed. At 7:44 p.m. the students watched the phone stream their faces back to them. The title bar stayed. The viewer count stayed at 0. Across the bottom, a thin line of text crawled, archiving, do not interrupt. The words repeated. The stream framed the room as a list, row by row, table by table, camera by camera. Names were not required. The lens kept count. Someone tried the side door to the alley with a chair as a battering ram. The chair splintered at the joint and bit the handler's thigh. The cry that followed went high and stopped mid-breath. The speaker answered with the same dry rhythm. Chop, chop, chop. The clock broke its beat and then found it again late. At 7:46 p.m. the ceiling vent coughed and fell silent. The heat rose a degree. Condensation crawled down the inside of the sneeze guard and dropped in slow, fat drips onto metal. The droplets struck lids with a spaced tick, filling the gaps between the chopping track and the clock. A three-part measure locked into place and looped until hearing itself became a task. The former coworker stared up at the dome nearest him. He lifted a fork as if the tines mattered. The fork touched plastic and came back with a thin scratch. The scratch did not show. The LED blinked on schedule. The dome stared. He dropped the fork. It clinked against steel and spun. The spin died without rolling off the edge, as if the tray had a lip for that. At 7:49 p.m. the live stream timer reads 0900. The students grouped around the screen and watched themselves crowd the phone. Faces leaned in and distorted at the lens edges. The stream widened then, cutting to a split frame that paired the live view with an overhead angle, crisp and indifferent. The title bar repeated across both halves. Menu spatial tonight. The viewer count stayed. The red dot stayed. A woman said, "Turn it off." The student said, "I can't." The woman tried anyway. The screen did not respond. A beep sounded, brisk and clinical. The phone snapped a still. A shutter sound marked the capture. The still froze faces in mid-plea, eyes wide, mouths parting. The still saved itself. The line at the bottom flickered and returned to archiving. At 7:52 p.m. a man pulled the dessert freezer from the wall. The rubber feet dragged and squealed. The plug held and then came loose with a soft pop. Cold air sighed out and fogged his forearms. He shoved the unit toward the door to use as a ram. The wheels hit the carpet and stopped dead, buried. The case leaned and settled. Frost melted in a smooth sheet along the top and dripped in steady threads to the floor. The television changed clips again. The same hat rolled through frame, crown crushed, footprint fixed in black. The camera zoomed. The mark filled the screen, an oval of dirt and grease that looked like a seal. The present hat did not exist here, only its print did. The room watched a document of small objects as if they were testimony. At 7:55 p.m. somebody screamed to break a window. The scream turned thin and ended. A spoon hit a pane in a stupid, hopeless tap. A metal tray hit after it with a proper sound. The pane bowed and held. The smaller crack widened a hair and stopped. The towel at the door bled through to the other side. At 7:57 p.m. the student's phone pulsed and then projected a new banner. Live record stored. The viewer count turned into a hyphen. The title bar brightened. Menu spatial tonight held the screen like a label on a jar. The student lowered the device. The camera on the ceiling continued to blink, a patient eye that never tired. At 8 p.m. the clock skipped a second. The flames at the pass did not. They kept their bars unbroken. Air swam over them in steady waves. Heat pressed higher. Gas braided into it and spread beneath the tables. Shoes scuffed and left darker prints. The carpet took them without complaint. The gas spread. The list went live. At 8:05 p.m., a group of guests moved toward the kitchen. Chairs tipped in their wake. Plates clattered to the floor. The gas pressed at their throats, and the blue bars of flame lit the pass in unnatural color. They found the steel door in the corner wall, its surface sweated with condensation, beads running like veins. The handle was cold to the touch. One man pulled. The hinge gave, slow and heavy, and a breath of air colder than night spilled out. The freezer yawned open. Light inside burned flat white, humming. Frost clung to the threshold in jagged edges. The temperature shifted in a single step. Heat from the dining room stopped at the frame. Beyond it, the cold cut skin raw, dry, and merciless. Breath fogged in front of mouths. Shoes squeaked on the icy floor. The walls dripped where metal met heat. They expected meat. Instead, they found an archive. Racks lined the left wall, not with food but with objects sealed in clear bags. Each was labeled in slanted black marker. A chef's hat, crown stained with a dark footprint. A folded letter with the word terminated stamped across its top. A dull knife, edge bent, spots of rust along the spine. Beside them lay smaller things. Napkins with embroidered initials, plastic name tags from uniforms, receipts curled at the edges. Every item was ordinary. Every item was humiliating. On the far wall hung a wooden board. Its surface bore rows of names written in block letters, neat and square. Beside each name a date. Beside each date a short note: slow knife, burned pan, spat food, laughed. The handwriting never changed. It was not decoration, it was record. Above the board, one word carved deep: menu spatial. The letters carried grooves filled with frost. At 8:08 p.m. someone whispered, "God." The word cracked in the cold air. No one else spoke. Their eyes traveled down the board. They saw their own names. Some at the top, written years before. Some in the middle, notes they remembered giving, words they had once thrown like scraps. A few were new, fresh ink, edges still glossy. In the corner, plastic storage bins stacked to shoulder height. Their lids were frosted shut. The first was forced open with a jerk. Inside lay objects folded and filed. A child's backpack strapped stiff with ice. A pair of glasses, lenses fractured. A driver's license pressed against the side of the plastic, face smiling, name bold. Another bin held a phone, its screen cracked but frozen mid-glow. The battery icon still faint under the ice. The air inside the freezer tasted metallic, sharp like iron filings. Each breath carried a sting. Fingers burned at the tips. One woman wrapped her scarf tighter around her mouth, but it iced over in seconds, hardening against her lips. At 8:12 p.m., a low whir started at the back wall. A small monitor blinked to life on a steel shelf. Its frame was covered in frost, buttons cracked, screen washed gray. Static pulsed for 2 beats. Then video appeared. A room filled the display, not this freezer but another dining space. People sat at tables, they ate from trays, they laughed. The time stamp in the corner marked a night 5 years earlier. The footage jumped. Same room, fewer guests. They looked around, confused, one hand on the door handle. The door did not move. The image stuttered. The next frame was black. Another clip, 2 years earlier. A group of teenagers filming each other at a table. One aimed a phone at the kitchen door. Their smiles froze when the lock clacked. The frame tilted. The picture ended. The monitor whined and cycled forward. Each recording ended the same. Light laughter, then sudden stillness, then black. At 8:16 p.m. a hand brushed against the wooden board. Frost flaked away. The ink shone fresh as if written minutes before. At the bottom of the list, space remained. One box unfilled. One blank line waiting. The former coworker stumbled back, hit a rack, and sent a bag tumbling. It slapped the floor and split. Inside lay a stained apron. Letters scrawled in marker across its hem, slow knife. The words bled into the fabric like a wound. He bent, stared, and then pushed it away with his shoe. The apron slid across the ice and hit the wall with a soft slap. The freezer hummed. The walls closed in with the weight of cold. Objects stared back, mute and damning. The camera lens in the ceiling corner blinked red. Another eye, another record. At 8:20 p.m. one guest reached for the bins again. Fingers peeled back ice. Inside they found shoes arranged in pairs, all sizes, frozen laces knotted tight. Another bin gave coats folded flat, ID still in pockets, every item catalogued, nothing discarded. The monitor shifted again. A clip from last year. The image showed a family of 3 sitting at a table. The child scraped a fork against a plate in rhythm with the clock. The frame shook, then dissolved into static. The screen returned to black. Breath came faster. Condensation thickened on the glass over trays. The blue flames outside the freezer hissed louder. Heat and cold pressed against each other at the threshold, an invisible door of pain. One man forced his knuckles down the list on the board. He found his name written clean, dated tonight. He stepped back, shoulders hitting another guest. No words came. The ink was proof enough. At 8:24 p.m. the monitor glitched again. This time the picture showed the current dining room. Live, the angle was from above, from one of the ceiling domes. The guests saw themselves in the present, framed by steel and gas, tiny and pale. Across the top ran the same banner, menu spatial tonight. The timer below ticked forward, recording, archiving, no viewers, no exit. In the silence, the clock outside ticked offbeat. The knife rhythm still carried through the speaker, muffled but present. Chop, chop, chop. Each sound etched deeper into the air. They realized the freezer was not storage. It was evidence. A grave made of objects, a library of humiliation, every item a witness, every record a verdict. At 8:28 p.m. someone pulled the door, but Frost held it open. The threshold burned with a mix of heat and ice. Sweat from the dining room met the freezer air and froze into crystals on jackets. The carpet outside darkened where frost melted into drops. Inside, the board with its empty line gleamed white with frost. The pen still lay on the shelf below, its tip uncapped, ink not yet dry. The freezer proved one thing: tonight was not the first. At 7 a.m. the fire crew pried the front door open. The glass gave with a crack and sighed inward. Hazy gas bled out into cool morning air. The neon sign above the window sputtered in daylight, weak and sickly. Its tubes stuttered without warmth. Boots crossed the threshold. The carpet clung to rubber soles, damp and tacky. The air inside held to the tongue, sweet with oil and bitter with gas. Smoke hung low, a gray veil that moved when doors opened and then settled again. A fork lay on the floor with a clean, bell-like ring still hiding in the metal. Paramedics spread out in pairs. Oxygen hissed. Plastic masks fogged with breath. 2 guests staggered to the doorway and sat on the threshold, eyes watering, jackets dark with condensation. Others did not rise. White sheets appeared, thin and utilitarian, edges fluttering in the fan's weak draft. The fans turned slowly and failed to move the room. The clock above the buffet ticked wrong in daylight. Its second hand lurched, then froze, then caught up. Police tape unspooled with a dry rip and wrapped the entrance posts. A camera dome in the ceiling corner blinked red and kept blinking. The old television hung crooked over the dessert case, screen black except for a pale word in the corner, archive. The tape over the buttons remained. At 7:20 a.m. the freezer door groaned. Frost feathered the gasket. The first officer recoiled at the temperature drop and called it in. The light inside glared without color. Breath turned to smoke and hung in front of faces. The room had been arranged. Racks held clear bags labeled in the same hand, a hat with a black footprint, a letter stamped in red, a dull knife. Napkins with embroidered initials sealed flat against plastic. Receipts curled at their corners like old leaves. A wooden board hung on the far wall, letters carved and filled with frost, menu spatial. Below, names and dates in black marker, short notes, spat food, laughed, slow knife. They found the bodies with care. No one spoke. Canvas-covered skin. Ice crackled under boots and fused again. The temperature gnawed. A bin held shoes paired heel to heel and frozen together by their laces. Another bin held coats, ID still in wallets, plastic edges rimed white. A child's backpack rested on top of a stack like a bright stone under glass. A detective breathed through wool and read the board. He pointed one gloved finger down the columns and stopped on a line near the bottom, dated last night. He looked back toward the door and then to the rack of bagged objects. He did not speak, but the glove tightened. By 7:40 a.m., the dining room had filled with radios and gloves and evidence bags. A tech scraped glass from the salad tray into a paper envelope. The pieces chimed once in the fold and went silent. Another tech photographed the serving line end to end, each tray a mirror that gave back warped faces and camera flashes as cold flares. The stainless steel wrote its own report in light. Outside, the sign shed a letter. The tube popped loose and swung by a wire, then fell. The word Buffett broke apart in the gutter. Only free burned in weak daylight. A brittle promise that hung crooked from its brackets. Wind moved it. It tapped the siding with a hollow note. At 8:10 a.m. media vans arrived. Tripods clicked into place. Cables uncoiled across wet asphalt. Reporters held microphones to the edge of tape. The buffet of names. One said into a camera, voice smooth, breath blooming white in the cold. A neighbor across the street shook her head and said, "He worked there once," and then said nothing else. Lenses followed the stretcher wheels and the slow, careful steps of men in paper suits. The search for Thomas Hale went through the kitchen and out to the alley. The back door remained latched. The lock showed no fresh scratches. A drain under the step carried oily water to a grate. The grate held a smear of ash and a thin, perfect triangle of glass. No footprints marked the runoff. No coat hung on the hook by the office door. The hook was bent at a tired angle. At 8:30 a.m., a brown leather notebook left the office in a clear evidence box. The strap crossed its cover like a belt. Condensation beaded on the inside of the plastic. The officer carrying it wore double gloves. He set the box on a stainless table under the clock's shadow and stepped aside. Another gloved hand lifted the lid and laid the book open. The pages held names and dates in the same disciplined hand as the freezer labels. Each line bore a small knife drawn with the inked confidence of habit. Some lines had been scratched so hard the paper tore and left a white wound. One page had been ripped out cleanly, fibers combed and bright along the seam. The room's sounds flattened as the pages turned, as if the book drew breath from the air. An officer read a cluster of entries aloud, low and exact. A medic by the door answered with a list of survivors. A second officer cross-checked the deceased. A third flipped a clipboard and pressed a pen until it squeaked. The names marched toward the last page. At 8:45 a.m. they reached the final line. The ink glistened under the lamp, not fully set. A thin smear at the tail of one letter marked a quick closure. The name on the line belonged to no survivor. It belonged to no body. It matched no ID from coats and wallets. The officer read it again. The room held. "Who?" Someone asked, soft and flat. "No one here," the reader said. The television remained on its bracket. The corner stamp stayed faint and patient. Archive held the screen like a watermark. The ceiling domes winked at their own intervals. The room kept recording itself without people in it. By 9 a.m., the tape at the entrance sagged and rose with the traffic of uniforms. The neon word "free" clicked in the breeze and kept its broken rhythm. Flies found the sugar spills near the dessert case and spun in tight, disoriented circles. The smell of burnt oil reached the pavement and settled in the lungs of those who waited at the barricade. The freezer door stood ajar, draining cold into warm air. A ring of frost formed on the threshold like a pale wreath. It melted, then formed again. Inside, the wooden board remained with its names and reasons. The bottom row still had space. The pen on the shelf sat uncapped. Tip pointed toward the open page, a dot of ink rounding at its mouth. By 9:20 a.m., the notebook returned to its box. The lid sealed with a dull click. The tag took a number in heavy black. The officer carried it past the clock that would not keep time, past the serving line that showed every face as a mask, past the door that clacked and held in memory even when open. He walked it through the tape and into daylight. The building closed behind him under a line of red seals. The windows reflected the street as smear and glare. The sign kept one word alive and let the rest fall. The list was unfinished, and someone else was already written.